66 million years ago, the sun had not yet risen. The sky above what would one day become the state of Montana was a deep, bruised purple. The kind of darkness that has no name in any human language because no human was alive to name it. The air was warm, thick, saturated with the smell of rotting vegetation, sulfur from distant volcanic vents, and something else, something animal, something alive and enormous and breathing. And then, a sound, not a roar, not yet, something lower, something felt in the chest before it is heard by the ears. A slow rhythmic exhalation, deep as a cave, long as a river. The sound of lungs the size of refrigerators emptying into the pre-dawn air. She was lying down. That alone would have surprised you. Everything you think you know about Tyrannosaurus rex, the upright posture, the thundering stride, the perpetual forward charge, none of it prepared you for this. For the reality of a 6-ton predator curled in the darkness of a floodplain depression, flanks rising and falling, tail stretched behind her like a fallen tree, head resting on the ground, with a particular stillness of something that has nothing in this world to fear. Her name, if we can give her one for the sake of this journey, was built from 68 million years of evolution. Every ancestor that survived, every ancestor that didn't. She was the product of a lineage so ancient, so ruthlessly refined, that calling her a predator feels like calling the ocean wet. It is technically correct. It captures almost nothing of the truth. She was approximately 28 years old. We know this because paleontologists can read age in bone the way a forester reads it in wood, through growth rings, microscopic bands of tissue laid down each year, preserved in stone across geological time. Research published in the journal Science by paleontologist Gregory Erickson and his colleagues established that Tyrannosaurus rex grew at extraordinary rates during adolescence, gaining as much as 2 kilograms per day during peak growth phases, before slowing dramatically in adulthood. At 28, she was old by Tyrannosaur standards. The average lifespan of a rex appears to have been somewhere between 28 and 32 years, based on the fossil record collected across formations from Hell Creek to Lance Creek. She had survived longer than most of her kind ever would, and the day that was about to begin would test every one of those 28 years. But before we follow her through the next 24 hours, before we watch her hunt, struggle, dominate, and survive, we need to understand the world she was waking up into. Because that world was nothing like the world we live in. And yet, in the most unsettling ways, it was recognizable. 66 million years ago, the Earth was in the late Maastrichtian stage of the Cretaceous period. The planet was warmer than today. Global average temperatures ran roughly 8 to 10 degrees Celsius higher than current levels, a fact established through oxygen isotope analysis of marine fossils. The polar ice caps were minimal. Sea levels were dramatically higher. An enormous shallow body of water called the Western Interior Seaway split North America down the middle, stretching from the Gulf of Mexico all the way north into what is now Canada, creating 2 separate land masses where the Great Plains now sit. The continent she walked was called Laramidia, the western portion of a divided North America. It was a land of coastal plains, vast river deltas, dense subtropical forests, and open floodplains crossed by braided river systems. The Hell Creek Formation, the geological record that preserves this world in stone, tells us that the environment was dynamic, shifting, and in many places profoundly unstable. Volcanic activity in the region that would become the Rocky Mountains was ongoing. Ash layers punctuate the Hell Creek sediments with geological regularity. This was not a stable paradise. This was a world on the edge of something vast and final, though nothing alive in it could have known that. The atmosphere carried more carbon dioxide than today. Plants grew in extraordinary abundance. Flowering plants, angiosperms, had been diversifying for tens of millions of years by this point and now dominated the lower vegetation layers of forest ecosystems. Ferns, cycads, and conifers filled the canopy and the spaces between rivers. Insects the size of your fist hummed through the heavy air. And through all of it, moving like something the landscape itself had generated, were the dinosaurs. Triceratops, Edmontosaurus, Pachycephalosaurus, Ankylosaurus, Thescelosaurus, duck-billed hadrosaurs in herds that left the ground trembling under thousands of feet, smaller theropods darting through underbrush, pterosaurs crossing the sky above river bends, wingspans stretching wider than a small aircraft, and above all of them, at the absolute apex of everything, Tyrannosaurus rex. There were not many of them. The best population estimates derived from density models applied to the fossil record and published by paleontologist Charles Marshall and colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley in 2021 suggest that at any given time, the total population of Tyrannosaurus rex across its entire range may have been somewhere around 20,000 individuals, spread across millions of square kilometers of Laramidia. Rare as tigers, dangerous as nothing else the Cretaceous had ever produced. She was one of 20,000, and she was about to wake up. The first light of the Cretaceous dawn was beginning to bleed into the eastern sky. Not the clean blue of modern mornings, but something yellower, hazier, filtered through an atmosphere carrying particulates from the volcanoes to the west. The temperature, which had cooled overnight to perhaps 18 degrees Celsius, was already beginning to climb. Birds, and yes, there were birds in the Hell Creek ecosystem, small feathered theropods that would survive what was coming, had begun calling from the tree lines along the nearest river channel, perhaps 300 meters to her east. She heard them. One eye opened. That eye, the subject of significant scientific investigation, was not the small laterally placed eye of a prey animal scanning wide arcs for threats. It faced partially forward, giving Tyrannosaurus rex a degree of binocular overlap and depth perception that would have been the envy of many predators. Research by Kent Stevens at the University of Oregon, using three-dimensional modeling of Tyrannosaur's skull geometry, estimated that Rex possessed a binocular field of view of roughly 55 degrees, significantly wider than that of modern alligators and comparable in some respects to that of hawks. That single open eye processed the dim light of early morning and found it satisfactory. She did not move immediately. This is perhaps one of the most important things to understand about an apex predator of her size and metabolic complexity. She was not built for constant motion. Every movement she made was expensive, caloric currency spent against a body budget that required enormous regular deposits. A rough estimate of her daily caloric needs, based on metabolic scaling models applied to her probable mass of between 8 and 9 metric tons, suggests she needed something in the range of 40,000 calories per day to maintain herself. On active hunting days, more. For reference, a human male engaged in moderate physical activity needs roughly 2,500 calories per day. She needed 16 times that amount just to exist. This meant that rest, genuine extended rest, was not laziness. It was strategy. Every hour she spent lying still was an hour her body was not burning through reserves she might desperately need later in the day. Every slow, deliberate movement she made was the result of millions of years of evolutionary pressure selecting for efficiency over spectacle. She was not lazy. She was precise. The second eye opened. She raised her head from the ground, a motion that involved the contraction of enormous neck muscles running along the dorsal surface of her cervical vertebrae, muscles that paleobiomechanical models suggest were among the most powerful in any terrestrial predator in Earth's history. Her head alone weighed roughly 600 kilograms. Lifting it was, by any physical measure, an act of considerable power, performed with the casualness of breathing. She scanned the floodplain. Nothing moved that should not move. The birds continued their calling. The wind came off the river, carrying moisture and the smell of hadrosaurs, that particular mixture of musk, vegetation fermenting in enormous digestive systems, and the warm, damp odor of large animals gathered near water. The hadrosaurs were there. Probably. Somewhere upstream, where the river bent around a stand of large conifers she could not see from her current position. She filed this information away in whatever cognitive architecture a tyrannosaur possessed. And here we must be honest. We know relatively little about tyrannosaur intelligence in any precise sense. Endocasts of Rex skulls suggest brain structures that were in some ways more complex than those of modern crocodilians, with enlarged olfactory bulbs indicating extraordinary smell and evidence of well-developed regions associated with spatial memory and behavioral flexibility. Some researchers have proposed that tyrannosaur cognitive abilities may have been closer to those of modern birds than to those of reptiles, which, given that birds are themselves living dinosaurs, may be less surprising than it first sounds. What she could do, in practical terms, she could remember where prey animals had been yesterday. She could anticipate where they would likely be today. She could read scent trails across kilometers. She could hear low-frequency vibrations through the ground itself, transmitted up through her feet and legs. And she could wait, patiently, with the kind of predatory patience that has no human equivalent, because humans have never been forced to evolve it. She stood up. This was, by any measure, a moment of pure geological drama. When a 9-ton animal rises from the ground responds. The floodplain sediment around her compacted slightly under the redistribution of her weight, the kind of compression that, in the right conditions, could be preserved in the fossil record as trace fossils, as footprints pressed centimeters deep into the ancient mud. Each of her 3 functional forward-facing toes, the large central digit flanked by 2 slightly shorter outer digits, spread under her weight, the massive claw on the inner toe pressing into the soft earth. She was approximately 4 meters tall at the hip, 12 meters from the tip of her snout to the tip of her tail. Standing, she could have looked directly into the window of a second-story building. Her tail, held horizontal and rigid behind her, counterbalanced the enormous weight of her head and torso, a biomechanical solution so elegant that it had persisted across theropod evolution for 150 million years. She stood for a moment in the gray light of the Cretaceous dawn, and then she opened her mouth. The sound that came out was not what Hollywood has given you. It was not the clean, dramatic roar of a lion or the manufactured shriek of the films. Research into the vocal anatomy of non-avian dinosaurs, informed by study of both their closest living relatives, crocodilians, and their avian descendants, suggests that tyrannosaurs likely produced closed-mouth vocalizations, deep, resonant booming sounds created by inflating throat or body cavities and expelling air in low-frequency pulses. Think of the deep infrasonic bellowing of an American alligator during mating season. Now scale it to a 12-meter animal with a chest cavity the size of a compact car. It would not have been a sound you heard so much as a sound you felt. It rolled across the empty floodplain and disappeared into the early morning air. A response came, distant from somewhere to the northwest. Another tyrannosaur. Whether a competitor, a potential mate, or a known individual, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that she registered the call, processed it, and made a decision about it. She turned southeast, away from the call, and she began to walk. 24 hours were beginning. Most of them you would not have survived. Before we follow her through a single step, we need to understand the world beneath her feet, because that world was not our world, not even close. 66 million years ago, the planet Earth was running hotter, wetter, and wilder than anything alive today has ever experienced. Global average temperatures were 8 to 10 degrees Celsius higher than current levels, a fact we know not from guesswork, but from oxygen isotope ratios locked inside marine fossils, analyzed across dozens of research programs over the past 4 decades. The polar ice caps were minimal. Sea levels were dramatically higher than today, and the continent she walked, the continent we now call North America, did not exist as we know it. It had been split in two. Down the middle of what is now the Great Plains ran an enormous shallow body of water called the Western Interior Seaway. It stretched from the Gulf of Mexico all the way north into present-day Canada, dividing the landmass into 2 separate continents. The western half, the land she called home, had its own name. Paleontologists call it Laramidia, and Laramidia was unlike anything on the modern map. Picture a long, narrow coastal strip of subtropical lowlands pressed between a rising mountain chain to the west and an inland sea to the east. The air was thick and warm and heavy with moisture coming off that sea. Rivers braided across wide floodplains, constantly shifting course, constantly depositing new layers of sediment that would one day become the Hell Creek Formation, the geological record that preserves this entire world in stone and bone and compressed time. The Hell Creek Formation stretches across parts of Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming. It is, in the language of paleontology, one of the most productive fossil-bearing units in the world. It has given us more specimens of Tyrannosaurus rex than any other place on Earth. Over 50 relatively complete individuals recovered since the first discovery in 1902. Every bone we will reference today, every behavioral inference, every measurement, most of it comes from this formation, from this exact landscape, from the ground directly beneath her feet. And that landscape, 66 million years ago, was extraordinary. The vegetation was dense and diverse. Flowering plants, angiosperms, had been diversifying for tens of millions of years by this point and now dominated the lower layers of the forest ecosystem. Ferns covered the floodplain floors in thick green carpets that bounced back within seasons after every flood. Cycads and tree ferns clustered along riverbanks. Towering conifers, relatives of modern sequoias and araucarias, formed the upper canopy in the drier inland areas, their trunks wider than a car is long, their crowns disappearing into a sky that was bluer and hazier than the sky above Montana today. Volcanic activity in the region that would become the Rocky Mountains was ongoing and persistent. On clear mornings, the horizon to the west sometimes glowed faintly with the amber light of distant eruptions. This was not a stable paradise. This was a world that had been slowly, steadily destabilizing for hundreds of thousands of years. The Deccan Traps, a massive volcanic province on the landmass that would one day become India, had been erupting episodically for roughly 300,000 years by this point, pumping carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere in quantities large enough to shift global climate patterns. Sea levels had been fluctuating. The western interior seaway was slowly retreating southward as tectonic forces raised the land beneath it. The world was changing, and the animals in it were changing with it, or trying to. The Hell Creek ecosystem was extraordinarily rich. Herds of Edmontosaurus, large duck-billed hadrosaurs reaching lengths of 13 meters and weights of 4 metric tons, moved across the floodplains in groups that may have numbered in the dozens, grazing on low vegetation with dental batteries containing hundreds of tightly packed teeth, continuously replacing themselves, capable of processing enormous quantities of tough plant material. Triceratops. That iconic three-horned ceratopsian was present in significant numbers, solitary or in small groups, its skull alone accounting for nearly a third of its total body length, carrying a frill of bone and skin that served purposes we still debate. Ankylosaurus armored itself in osteoderms, bony plates fused into the skin, and carried a tail club that biomechanical studies published in the journal PLOS One calculated could swing with forces sufficient to shatter bone. Smaller dinosaurs filled every ecological niche between the giants. Pachycephalosaurus carried a dome of solid bone up to 25 centimeters thick on top of its skull. Vescalosaurus moved through underbrush with the quick, nervous energy of an animal that survived by not being noticed. Ornithomimids, ostrich-like dinosaurs with long legs and toothless beaks, could reach running speeds that modern estimates place at somewhere between 40 and 60 kilometers per hour. Above all of them, pterosaurs crossed the sky. Quetzalcoatlus northropi, the largest flying animal in the history of life on Earth, with a wingspan approaching 10 to 11 meters, soared on thermal currents above the Hell Creek floodplains. When it landed, it stood as tall as a modern giraffe. It is simultaneously the most spectacular and the most underappreciated animal in this entire ecosystem. And moving through all of it, through the herds and the forests and the river crossings and the open mudflats, were the tyrannosaurs. Not many of them. This is critical to understand. Population estimates for Tyrannosaurus rex, calculated by paleontologist Charles Marshall and colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley, and published in the journal Science in 2021, suggest a total living population at any given time of roughly 20,000 individuals, spread across millions of square kilometers of Laramidia. If you were standing anywhere in the Hell Creek ecosystem on any given day, the nearest living tyrannosaur might be tens of kilometers away. They were not everywhere. They were rare, wide-ranging, and deeply embedded in the upper architecture of the food web, the kind of predator whose presence is felt across an entire ecosystem, even when the animal itself is nowhere to be seen. She was one of 20,000. Approximately 28 years old, based on the growth ring analysis that paleontologist Gregory Erickson and colleagues at Florida State University pioneered, a method of reading annual bone deposition bands in thin-sectioned tyrannosaur femora, the same principle used to age trees. 28 was old for her kind. Most tyrannosaurs in the fossil record died younger. The reasons were not always predation, although injury, infection, and competition took their toll. At her age, the teeth showed wear. The skeleton carried healed fractures and the subtle remodeling of bone around old injuries. She had survived things that had killed others of her kind. She was, in the precise biological sense of the word, exceptional. Her body was built to a specification that had been refined across 150 million years of theropod evolution. She stood 4 meters tall at the hip, measured 12 meters from snout to tail tip, weighed, by current best estimates, derived from volumetric modeling of complete skeletons, somewhere between 8 and 9 metric tons. Her skull alone was 1.5 meters long. The bones fused into a structure that could withstand the stress of biting forces that, according to research published in Scientific Reports by Paul Gignac and Gregory Erickson in 2017, exceeded 64,000 newtons at the back teeth. That is the highest bite force ever calculated for any terrestrial animal. The closest modern competitor, the saltwater crocodile, generates roughly 16,000 newtons. She bit 4 times harder than the most powerful biting animal alive today. Her arms, famously, infamously small, were in reality powerful, heavily muscled structures capable of lifting several hundred kilograms, likely used to grip prey at close quarters once the initial bite was delivered. They were not vestigial. They were not jokes. They were specialized tools that evolution had been steadily reducing in length while increasing in raw strength, a trade-off whose ultimate purpose remains one of the genuinely open questions in Tyrannosaur paleobiology. Her vision faced forward with partial binocular overlap. Her olfactory bulbs, the brain structures dedicated to processing smell, were proportionally enormous, suggesting a sense of smell that may have rivaled or exceeded that of modern turkey vultures, animals capable of detecting carrion from over a kilometer away. Her hearing, inferred from the structure of her inner ear, was likely tuned to low frequencies, well suited to detecting the heavy footfalls of large prey animals through dense vegetation. She was, in short, a sensory array wrapped around a bone-crushing engine, walking on 2 legs through a world that had spent 66 million years building up to producing her. And on this particular morning, on this one specific day that we have chosen to follow, the conditions were these. The temperature at dawn, approximately 19 degrees Celsius and rising. The wet season was transitioning toward the drier months, and the floodplain around her was still soft from recent rains, the soil dark and compressed, holding the impressions of every animal that had crossed it in the past week. The river to the east was running high and brown, carrying sediment from upstream rains. The wind came from the northeast, off the inland sea, carrying moisture and the layered scent information of everything it had passed over in the past several hours. She stood in the gray pre-dawn light of Laramidia. She raised her head, and she began to gather information about the day. The smell reached her before anything else did. Not a single smell, a layered architecture of chemical information built up across the night and carried to her on the northeast wind. Decoding it took her perhaps 3 seconds. To us, standing in the same spot, the air would have smelled of mud and vegetation and distant rain. To her, it was a detailed map of everything that had moved through this landscape since sunset. Hadrosaurs, several of them. Upstream near the river bend, the same location as yesterday. The scent was hours old but still strong enough to carry distance and direction with confidence. They had fed through the night along the riverbank and were almost certainly still there, or close to it. Something else, smaller, a group of ornithomimids that had crossed the floodplain perhaps 2 hours before dawn, moving northwest at speed. Their scent trail was already thinning, dispersing in the warming air. Not worth pursuing. And something else again, fainter, harder to read. Another tyrannosaur, male based on biochemical markers that recent research into avian olfactory communication suggests large theropods may have been capable of detecting. Distance, Difficult to estimate precisely, but the scent had been deposited sometime in the past 12 hours, moving east toward the seaway. Not a current threat. Filed and noted. She turned her head slowly into the wind and held it there. This behavior, this long, deliberate inhalation while facing the source of a scent, has a direct parallel in modern Komodo dragons, which use a similar head-turning technique to triangulate odor sources using the bilateral spacing of their olfactory organs. In Tyrannosaurs, the nasal passages were large, complex, and lined with an estimated surface area of olfactory epithelium that dwarfed that of any modern terrestrial predator. Research by Lawrence Whitmer at Ohio University, using CT scanning of Tyrannosaurus skull cavities, revealed nasal passages far more elaborate than their external openings suggested. Turbinate structures that increased contact time between incoming air and sensory tissue, wringing every molecule of information from every breath. She was not sniffing casually. She was reading. And what she read told her the hadrosaurs were the opportunity of the morning. She began to walk. The first thing to understand about a tyrannosaur in motion is that it was nothing like what the films show you. There was no thundering charge, no ground-shaking sprint, no roaring approach that announced itself from half a kilometer away. That version of Tyrannosaurus Rex, the one that hunts with the subtlety of a freight train, is a Hollywood invention built on the assumption that an apex predator of this size had no need of stealth. The fossil record suggests otherwise. Biomechanical modeling of tyrannosaur locomotion, most comprehensively performed by John Hutchinson at the Royal Veterinary College in London, using three-dimensional skeletal models and muscle mass estimates, indicates that adult Tyrannosaurus rex was not a fast runner in the absolute sense. Top speed estimates range, depending on the model and the assumptions fed into it, from 17 to 40 kilometers per hour. The lower end of that range is now considered more likely for large adults. A healthy human athlete runs the 100 meters at roughly 25 kilometers per hour. An adult rex at full extension was probably not dramatically faster than that, and could certainly not sustain high speed for more than a few seconds before the metabolic and mechanical costs became prohibitive. But speed, for her, was rarely the point. What she had instead was efficiency. Her stride length, the distance covered with each complete cycle of her legs, was extraordinary. Trackway evidence from multiple tyrannosaur trace fossil sites, including specimens studied at sites across North America, shows stride lengths of up to 4 meters in large adults moving at moderate pace. This means that at a walking speed that required relatively little energy, she covered ground at a rate that would have forced a human to jog to keep pace. She didn't need to run. She needed to close distance without triggering flight responses in prey animals that had evolved over millions of years to run from exactly what she was. So she walked carefully. The floodplain was soft under her feet. Each step left a clear impression. 3 forward-facing toes, the central digit longest, pressing into the dark mud with the weight of a small vehicle distributed across a surface area that kept her from sinking too deeply. The small vestigial first toe, the dew claw, set high on the ankle, barely registered in the substrate. Her footprints were roughly 80 centimeters long. For comparison, the largest human foot ever recorded measured 48 centimeters. She moved in the direction of the river, using the tree line along the bank as a reference and a partial screen. The vegetation here was dense enough to break her silhouette, important because the hadrosaurs she was approaching had eyes set wide on their skulls, giving them a nearly panoramic field of view. They could not see well in front of them. but they could see almost everything to the sides, and they were extremely sensitive to large moving shapes in open ground. She was not moving in open ground. She was moving along the forest edge, in the partial shadow of the conifers, where her dark coloration, inferred from comparisons with large modern predators and the general principle that animals in complex vegetated environments tend toward countershading or disruptive patterning, would have broken her outline against the alternating light and shadow of the early morning. We do not know the precise coloration of Tyrannosaurus rex. We cannot. Soft tissue color is almost never preserved in the fossil record. What we can say, based on phylogenetic bracketing, the method of inferring traits in extinct animals by examining the range of traits in their closest living relatives, is that large theropods likely had some degree of pigmentation in their skin, possibly including patterns, and that an animal of her size operating in a visually complex environment had evolutionary reasons to avoid being conspicuous. She may not have been the monotone gray-green of old museum paintings. She may have been something stranger. Something that, if you saw it moving through the shadows of a Cretaceous forest edge, you might not immediately recognize as the most dangerous animal on the continent. She stopped. 50 meters ahead, the tree line opened onto a broad gravel bar along the river's edge, and on that gravel bar, moving with the slow rocking gait of large herbivores at their morning feed, were 4 Edmontosaurus. She assessed them without moving. The group consisted of 2 large adults, females based on their size relative to known sexual dimorphism in hadrosaurs, 1 younger individual perhaps 2/3 their size, and 1 animal that walked with a slight irregularity in its left hind limb. A mild injury perhaps, old or recent, impossible to tell from here. That last animal she noted specifically. This is not anthropomorphization. This is documented predatory behavior observed across multiple modern large predators from wolves to lions to killer whales. The targeting of individuals displaying any deviation from the movement pattern of the group. Injured animals move differently. Differently moving animals are easier to isolate. Predators that consistently identify and target compromised prey animals leave more offspring than predators that do not. The behavior was millions of years old before she was born. She watched. The hadrosaurs fed along the gravel bar, pulling at low vegetation along the waterline with their broad, flat bills. Dental batteries of hundreds of tightly packed, self-replacing teeth grinding vegetation with a side-to-side jaw motion more similar to a mammalian ungulate than to most reptiles. They were not silent. They moved through the water-edge plants with audible crackling and tearing, and they communicated in low, resonant calls. Closed-mouth vocalizations not unlike those of large birds, carrying information about the group's location and behavioral state. They had not detected her. She was downwind. She was still. And at 50 meters, partially screened by the last trees of the forest edge, her silhouette was broken enough that the hadrosaur's wide-set eyes, optimized for detecting movement across a broad field rather than resolving detail at distance, had not flagged her as a threat. She had perhaps 30 meters of open gravel bar between the forest edge and the nearest animal. 30 meters. At her stride length and a moderate acceleration, that was perhaps 4 seconds of movement. 4 seconds between stillness and contact. She did not move yet, because this moment of absolute held stillness before the commitment was perhaps the most important skill a predator of her size possessed. The metabolic cost of a failed charge was enormous. The risk of injury during a chase across uncertain ground was real. A broken toe, a twisted ankle, a fall at full stride. Any of these could begin a cascade of physical deterioration that ended in starvation. Large predators do not heal the way small ones do. They cannot afford repeated high-risk attempts the way a hunting animal 1/10 their size can. She would not move until the moment was as close to certain as the world ever allows anything to be. The injured hadrosaur took 3 steps away from the group, reaching toward a clump of ferns at the water's edge. It was now slightly separated, slightly angled away, its attention entirely on the vegetation in front of it. She read all of this in the space of one breath. And then she moved. 30 meters of open gravel disappeared in 4 seconds. Not silently. Nothing 9 tons moving at speed is silent, but faster than the hadrosaur's nervous systems could translate the sudden explosion of sound and motion into coordinated flight response. By the time the nearest animal registered the vibration through the ground and began to turn its head, she was already past the point of no return, already committed, already inside the distance at which escape was possible. The injured hadrosaur saw her at 10 meters. What happened in its body in that moment is something we can describe with physiological precision. Adrenaline flooded its bloodstream. Its heart rate spiked. Its digestive system shut down entirely as blood was redirected to the major muscle groups. Every system not related to immediate survival was switched off in a fraction of a second by a nervous system that had been refined across millions of years of being prey to animals exactly like her. It turned. It pushed off with both hind limbs. It ran. The other 3 hadrosaurs exploded in different directions, a scatter response, instinctive, designed to split a predator's attention and force a choice. It works. Against most predators, it works extremely well. A lion faced with a scattering herd must commit to one animal and watch the others disappear. The same is true of wolves, of hunting dogs, of every coursing predator that relies on sustained pursuit to make its kill. She had already made her choice. She stayed locked on the injured animal. The chase across the gravel bar lasted approximately 12 seconds. We can be specific about this not because anyone was there to time it, but because biomechanical modeling of tyrannosaur locomotion, combined with what we know about hadrosaur maximum sprint speeds, estimated at roughly 45 kilometers per hour for healthy adults, gives us the parameters of the engagement. The injured animal was slower than a healthy one. She was closing at a rate that left only one possible outcome. But outcomes in nature are never truly inevitable. The hadrosaur hit the water. The river at this point was approximately 40 meters wide and running fast and brown from upstream rains. The hadrosaur was a strong swimmer. Hadrosaurs, based on trackway evidence showing swimming traces in multiple Cretaceous formations, including specimens described from sites in British Columbia, were capable of propelling themselves through water using their hind limbs in a paddling motion, their large tails providing additional thrust. She stopped at the water's edge. This moment, this specific hesitation at the riverbank, is not a Hollywood invention. It is, in fact, one of the most scientifically interesting behavioral inferences we can make about Tyrannosaurus rex. Her body was not built for swimming. 9 metric tons of dense bone and muscle, with a center of mass positioned far forward over her hind limbs, made deep water genuinely dangerous. A fall in fast current could be catastrophic. Research into tyrannosaur bone density and body composition suggests she was not naturally buoyant. She would have been fighting the current from the moment she lost bottom contact. She watched the hadrosaur reach the far bank. For 3 seconds, she stood at the waterline, the river running cold and fast around her feet. Then she turned back. There is something in this moment that is worth sitting with. Not because it represents failure, In the predator's calculus, a hunt abandoned before serious injury risk is not failure. It is rational decision-making. But because it reveals something about the cognitive complexity of this animal that purely instinct-driven models of dinosaur behavior cannot accommodate. She assessed the risk. She weighed the cost. She made a choice. She walked back across the gravel bar. The other 3 hadrosaurs were long gone, scattered into the forest on the far side of the bar, their retreat tracked by the diminishing sound of their footfalls and the lingering cloud of scent they had left in the warming air. She passed through that scent cloud and extracted information from it. Stress hormones present in the fresh musk of fleeing animals, detectable in concentrations that modern research into large predator olfaction suggests would have been well within her sensory range. They were gone. This location was burned for the next several hours at minimum. She had been awake for less than 90 minutes. She had not eaten. This was not unusual. The success rate of large predator hunts across modern ecosystems gives us a baseline for inference. Lions succeed in roughly 1 in 4 attempts. Wolves, depending on terrain and pack size, succeed in roughly 1 in 5 to 1 in 10. Cheetahs, the most specialized pursuit predator alive today, succeed in roughly half their attempts, but pay a significant energetic cost for each one. For a predator of her size and mass, operating as what was almost certainly a predominantly solitary hunter based on the spacing and density of tyrannosaur fossils in the Hell Creek Formation, success rates may have been somewhere in the range of 1 successful kill every 3 to 5 hunting attempts. She did not panic. She did not despair. These are human responses to human timescales. She simply continued moving. The morning was heating up now. The temperature had climbed to perhaps 24 degrees Celsius, and the heavy moisture in the air was beginning to press down on the landscape with the particular weight of a subtropical morning building toward midday heat. Insects, enormous by modern standards, with dragonfly relatives sporting wingspans approaching 15 centimeters, moved in clouds above the vegetation along the river. Small feathered theropods, distantly related to her but separated by 150 million years of divergent evolution, flickered through the lower branches of the conifers, calling in rapid, high-pitched sequences. She moved south, parallel to the river, following its course without approaching the bank directly. Her pace was unhurried, the long, efficient stride that covered ground without burning reserves. Each footfall pressed into the soft earth with a regularity that was almost meditative, the great tail swinging slightly with each step to maintain balance. The enormous head carried low and forward, the small arms folded close against the chest. She was covering perhaps 6 to 8 kilometers per hour at this pace. Slow by any sprinting standard. Extraordinary in terms of the ground she could cover over the course of a full day without meaningful metabolic strain. She had covered perhaps 2 kilometers south of the failed hunt when the scent reached her. Old blood. And something else. Carrion. The smell was perhaps 400 meters to the southwest, carried on a shift in the morning wind. Old enough to have developed the complex chemical signature of active decomposition, gases produced by bacterial breakdown of organic tissue, detectable to a tyrannosaur at ranges that modern vulture olfaction studies suggest could exceed a kilometer under favorable wind conditions, fresh enough that significant edible material remained. Something large had died recently, within the past 24 hours. She turned southwest without hesitation. Here we encounter one of the most persistent and most bitterly contested debates in tyrannosaur paleobiology. Was Tyrannosaurus rex primarily an active predator or primarily a scavenger? The debate was most publicly framed by paleontologist Jack Horner, who excavated some of the most significant Tyrannosaur specimens ever found, including the famous specimen known as MOR 125 from the Hell Creek Formation, who argued for many years that Rex's forward-facing eyes, powerful olfactory system, and relatively limited sprinting ability made it better suited to finding and processing already dead animals than to actively hunting live ones. The scientific consensus today has moved decisively away from obligate scavenging as a primary strategy. The evidence is extensive. Healed bite marks, meaning bite wounds that the prey animal survived long enough for bone to begin remodeling around, proving the animal was alive when bitten, have been found on hadrosaur and other dinosaur bones bearing tyrannosaur tooth signatures. Tail vertebrae of an Edmontosaurus, described by Bruce Rothschild and colleagues, show healed tyrannosaur bite marks, proving that the hadrosaur survived at least one Rex attack. This is not the signature of a scavenger. Research into the biomechanics of Rex's forelimbs, its locomotion, and its predatory dentition all point toward an animal capable of and adapted for active hunting. But here is the part that Horner got right, even if his conclusion went too far. She would absolutely eat carrion, whenever she found it, without hesitation or preference. A 9-ton animal with 40,000 calorie daily energy requirements could not afford to be selective about the source of those calories. Active predation was primary. Scavenging was opportunistic. Both were part of the same behavioral repertoire, deployed as circumstances demanded. And right now, circumstances were demanding she investigate what was dead to the southwest. She found it at the edge of a dense stand of tree ferns, where the ground dropped slightly into a shallow depression that had held standing water during the recent rains. It was a subodont triceratops, perhaps 4 metric tons. The animal had been dead for somewhere between 12 and 18 hours, based on the degree of decomposition visible and the extent to which smaller scavengers, small mammals, insects, possibly a small theropod or two, had already accessed the carcass. She stopped 3 meters away and read the scene. No other large predator present. The scent signatures around the carcass were exclusively smaller animals. She was alone with it. She approached and began to feed. What followed was not elegant. It was not the clean, cinematic predation sequence that wildlife documentaries have trained us to expect. Feeding in a large theropod was a process of enormous physical force applied to the structural problem of accessing the calorie-dense tissues inside a large carcass: muscle, organ tissue, bone marrow. Her teeth, those famous serrated banana-shaped teeth that were not knife blades but bone crushers, gripped and pulled with the full leverage of her neck muscles, tearing sections of flesh and hide free in chunks that she swallowed largely whole. Her jaw did not chew in the mammalian sense. It seized, crushed, stripped, and swallowed. The bone-crushing bite force that researchers Gignac and Erickson calculated, 64,000 newtons at maximum, was not primarily for killing. Many paleontologists now believe it was primarily for this, for cracking the long bones of large carcasses to access the marrow inside, extracting the last caloric value from a food source that other predators and scavengers could not reach. Tyrannosaur teeth have been found with bone fragments embedded in their serrations. Their coprolites, fossil feces, contain crushed bone fragments in quantities and sizes that no other known predator of the Hell Creek ecosystem could have produced. She was the only animal in this ecosystem that could eat the bones. She fed for approximately 40 minutes. In that time, she consumed somewhere in the range of 80 to 100 kilograms of material. Significant, but not sufficient for the day. She would need to hunt again. The sun was fully up now, and the Cretaceous morning was becoming a Cretaceous midday. The temperature was climbing toward 30 degrees Celsius, and the air above the open floodplain shimmered slightly with early heat haze. The shadow of a Quetzalcoatlus, that enormous pterosaur cruising effortlessly on thermals rising from the warming ground, swept silently across the landscape, passing over her without reaction from either animal. She raised her head from the carcass. She scanned the tree line. She breathed the air. The day was still young. She was still hungry. And somewhere out there, in the heat and the ferns and the braided river channels of Laramidia, something was walking that did not yet know she was looking for it. By mid-morning, the floodplain had become a different place entirely. The soft, navigable world of the pre-dawn hours, cool mud, long shadows, the easy movement of large animals through the gray light, had been replaced by something harder and more demanding. The sun above Laramidia was not the filtered, moderate sun of modern Montana. It beat down through an atmosphere carrying more carbon dioxide, more water vapor, more particulate matter from the western volcanoes than any modern sky. The light was intense and slightly diffuse, casting softer shadows than we are accustomed to, heating the dark floodplain sediment rapidly and radiating that heat back upward in waves that made the distant tree lines ripple and blur. The temperature was approaching 32 degrees Celsius. For her, this presented a physiological question that paleontologists have spent decades arguing over and have only recently begun to resolve. Was Tyrannosaurus rex warm-blooded or cold-blooded? The honest answer, as of current research, is neither and both, and something in between that we are still developing the vocabulary to describe properly. For most of the 20th century, dinosaurs were assumed to be ectotherms, cold-blooded animals like modern reptiles, dependent on external heat sources to regulate their body temperature, sluggish in the cold, active in the warmth. This model made Tyrannosaurus rex a slow, lumbering, sun-dependent animal, closer to a giant lizard than to anything warm and fast and dangerous. That model is now considered largely incorrect. The revolution in our understanding began with bone histology, the microscopic study of bone tissue structure. Research pioneered by paleontologist Armand de Riclès in France and later expanded by John Jack Horner, Christina Curry Rogers, and many others, demonstrated that tyrannosaur bone tissue shows the fast, uninterrupted growth rings characteristic of endothermic animals, warm-blooded physiology. Cold-blooded animals grow in pulses, their growth rings reflecting seasons of activity and inactivity. Tyrannosaur bone grew rapidly and continuously in a pattern more similar to modern birds and mammals than to modern reptiles. But the most compelling recent evidence came from isotope analysis. A study published in the journal Science Advances in 2022, led by Yasmina Veman at the California Institute of Technology, analyzed the chemical signatures preserved in tyrannosaur bone, specifically the ratio of certain isotopes produced by metabolic activity. The results placed Tyrannosaurus rex firmly in the endothermic range, running a body temperature estimated at somewhere between 38 and 40 degrees Celsius, closer to a bird than to a crocodile. What this means for our animal, standing in 32-degree midday heat, is significant. She was not energized by the warmth the way a reptile would be. She was not dependent on it. Her metabolism ran hot regardless of the ambient temperature, an internal furnace that demanded constant fuel but provided constant capability. She could have been as dangerous at midnight as at noon, as capable in the cool of early morning as in the peak heat of midday. But heat still mattered. A 9-ton endotherm generates an enormous amount of metabolic heat simply by existing. Moving generates more, In the peak heat of a Cretaceous midday, thermoregulation, keeping her core temperature within the functional range, required behavioral management. Modern large endotherms handle this in various ways. Elephants use their enormous ears as radiators, increasing blood flow to the thin skin to dump excess heat. Large birds pant. Hippos spend the hottest hours in water. She sought shade. The move was gradual and unhurried, not a retreat, but a repositioning. She moved away from the open floodplain toward the denser vegetation along the river, where the canopy of large conifers and the proximity of water kept the temperature several degrees lower. Here, in the filtered green light of the forest edge, she slowed her pace to a near stop and stood in the shadow of a conifer whose trunk was wider than a car. She was not sleeping. She was not inert. Her senses were still running at full capacity. The olfactory processing that ran continuously, the low-frequency vibration sensitivity transmitted through her feet from the ground, the forward-facing eyes scanning the middle distance with the patient intensity of an animal that had nowhere more important to be. She was simply waiting for the day to cool slightly before continuing. This behavioral pattern, active at dawn, reduced activity during peak midday heat, resumed activity in the late afternoon, is observed across large predators and hot environments worldwide today. Lions spend up to 20 hours per day resting. Tigers are most active at dawn and dusk. Komodo dragons, despite their ectothermy, seek shade during peak heat. The pattern is not weakness. It is energy management refined to an art form by hundreds of millions of years of selection pressure. While she rested, the world around her continued its business. 30 meters away in a dense stand of ferns along the riverbank, a group of small mammals moved through the leaf litter. They were roughly the size of modern possums, nocturnal by preference, but active during the day in the safety of dense cover. Their lineage stretched back tens of millions of years, and it would stretch forward, these small, nervous, opportunistic creatures, past everything that was coming. Past the day that was now approximately 66 million years in the future from where you sit reading this. They were the inheritors. They simply did not know it yet. Above the river, a pair of Hesperornis, large flightless diving birds, more closely related to modern loons than to any dinosaur, surfaced from the water with fish in their beaks. They were not silent about their success. They called to each other in the way of birds everywhere, with a specificity and emotional immediacy that felt oddly familiar against the ancient strangeness of everything around them. She registered all of it, filed it, continued waiting. And then, at what we might estimate as approximately 11:30 in the morning, something changed. The ground told her first. Low-frequency vibrations transmitted up through her feet from the substrate are not simply felt as vague trembling. Research into the mechanoreceptor systems of large archosaurs, informed by study of crocodilian skin sensory organs and avian foot sensitivity, suggests that large theropods may have been capable of extracting directional and distance information from ground vibrations with significant precision. Not echolocation, something more primitive and more intimate, the direct reading of the Earth itself as a communication medium. Something very large was moving, to the south, perhaps 600 meters, moving at a moderate pace heading northwest toward the river. She turned her head. She breathed. The wind was from the northeast. Whatever was to the south was upwind of her. She could not read its scent yet, but the vibration pattern was informative. The footfall rhythm was quadrupedal, 4 beats with a particular weight distribution that she had encountered before. Heavy front impact, lighter rear. the distinctive signature of a large ceratopsian. Triceratops. Probably a single animal. The vibration pattern lacked the multiplied complexity of a group. A solitary individual, which was not unusual for Triceratops. Based on the spacing of the footfalls and the estimated speed, it was large. Very large. An adult male, possibly. Triceratops males reaching lengths of 9 meters and weights approaching 12 metric tons in the largest known specimens. She did not move immediately. This was the calculation that every large predator must perform, and it is more complex than it appears. Triceratops was not simply large prey. It was dangerous prey. That 3-meter frill of bone and skin, the 2 massive brow horns reaching lengths of over a meter, the shorter nasal horn, these were not merely display structures. Bite marks and horn impact damage found on tyrannosaur bones from the Hell Creek Formation are direct fossil evidence that these two animals engaged in combat, and that the outcomes were not always favorable for the predator. A paper published in the journal PLOS ONE by Denver Fowler and colleagues examined healed injuries on tyrannosaur facial bones consistent with Triceratops' horn impact. The predator did not always win these encounters. An adult Triceratops, cornered or provoked, was a genuinely lethal animal. She weighed this. The vibrations continued their steady approach. The animal was following the natural corridor of the river valley, moving toward water. It had not detected her. She was still downwind, screened by vegetation. She had the advantage of information. She began to move parallel to its path, staying in the tree cover, maintaining the distance between them. She was not attacking. Not yet. She was reading the animal, learning its movement pattern, its pace, its attentiveness, looking for the same thing she always looked for: deviation, irregularity, the subtle signature of vulnerability. The Triceratops came into view through a gap in the ferns, and it was enormous. A fully mature male, his frill a deep reddish-brown at the edges, his 2 brow horns scarred and worn from years of use in intraspecific combat with other males. He walked with the ponderous confidence of an animal that had lived long enough to outlast most threats. His head swung slightly from side to side as he moved, the frill catching the dappled light beneath the forest canopy. She watched him for perhaps 2 minutes. He reached the river's edge and lowered his vast head to drink. In that moment of lowered head, reduced visibility, and physical commitment to a stationary behavior, she assessed him one final time. And she made her decision. Not today. The calculation was simple and brutal and entirely rational. A healthy adult male Triceratops at full alertness and physical capability represented a risk-to-reward ratio that did not favor attack. The caloric reward was immense, enough food to sustain her for days, but the probability of injury was too high. Those horns at close quarters, in the confined space of the river edge, with uncertain footing on wet gravel, the potential consequences ranged from a pierced limb to a horn through the torso. Either outcome would likely be fatal over the days and weeks that followed. She had eaten this morning. She had time. She would wait for a better opportunity, a different animal, a more favorable set of circumstances. She backed slowly into the ferns and held still until the Triceratops finished drinking and moved on, its footfall vibrations fading gradually to the northwest. The forest was quiet again. The midday heat pressed down on Laramidia with the indifference of a sun that had no idea what it was shining on. She turned east, back toward the open floodplain, and stood at the forest edge looking out across 2 kilometers of open ground. Somewhere out there, the afternoon was waiting, and the afternoon in the Hell Creek ecosystem 66 million years ago had a way of producing the unexpected. The heat broke slowly. By the middle of the afternoon, the temperature had peaked at 34 degrees Celsius and begun its gradual retreat, the sun shifting westward and the shadows of the conifers stretching longer across the floodplain. The wind off the inland sea picked up slightly, carrying moisture and the promise of cooler air that was still hours away. The insects that had fallen into near silence during the peak heat began again their layered, ceaseless noise, a sound so omnipresent in the Cretaceous that it was, in a sense, the baseline frequency of the entire world. She moved back onto the open floodplain. The afternoon hours in the Hell Creek ecosystem were in some ways the most complex of the day. The heat of midday had pushed most large herbivores into shade or toward water, compressing them into predictable locations. As the temperature dropped, they would begin moving again, spreading out across the landscape, resuming feeding, following the established pathways between water sources and vegetation patches that large animals in any ecosystem carve into the landscape through sheer repetition over years and decades. She knew these pathways, not in the way that implies conscious mapping or deliberate memorization, but in the way that an animal which has moved through the same landscape for 28 years accumulates a spatial understanding so deep and so automatic that it functions as something indistinguishable from knowledge. She knew where the hadrosaur herds watered in the late afternoon. She knew which river crossings the Triceratops used when moving between feeding grounds. She knew which areas of open ground were likely to hold young, inexperienced animals separated from protective groups. This accumulated spatial intelligence is not speculative romanticism. It is documented across modern large predators with comparable lifespans. Older lionesses in Amboseli have been tracked using routes that demonstrably optimize for prey location during specific seasonal and daily cycles. Routes that younger animals in the same pride do not use because they have not yet learned them. Orca matriarchs carry ecological knowledge about prey location that their pods depend on for survival, knowledge demonstrated to degrade measurably in pods that lose their eldest female. Age in apex predators is not merely survival. It is accumulated strategic intelligence. At 28 years old, she was the sum of everything this landscape had ever taught her. She moved southeast toward a broad, shallow section of the river, approximately 4 kilometers from her midday resting position. This crossing point, a natural ford where the river spread wide and thin over a gravel substrate, was a reliable convergence zone. Animals crossing between the eastern floodplain and the denser forest to the west used it regularly. She had learned this years ago. She had used this knowledge before. She settled into the long ground-covering stride of a predator not yet in pursuit, but already hunting. Along the way, the landscape offered her continuous information. A cluster of broken fern fronds at the forest edge, recent, the white of the snapped stems not yet oxidized, told her something large had moved through within the past few hours, pushing from the forest onto the open ground. The scent trail confirmed hadrosaurs, a group of perhaps 6 to 8 animals moving northeast. She filed the direction and continued toward the ford. 3 kilometers into her walk, she encountered something unexpected. Bones. Scattered across a depression in the floodplain, partially buried by recent floodwater deposit, were the disarticulated remains of a large animal. The bones were old, the surfaces chalky and checked, the color bleached by exposure over what appeared to be several seasons. Most of the accessible material had been stripped long ago by scavengers. What remained was structural: limb bones, a section of vertebral column, fragments of what had been a very large skull. She stopped and assessed the site. The bones were not food. She would not have recognized them as belonging to her own species. That kind of abstract self-recognition is almost certainly beyond the cognitive architecture of any non-avian dinosaur. But she registered the scale of the remains, and in some functional sense, she registered that this had been an animal of comparable size to herself. She moved on after perhaps 30 seconds. What we, standing in her position with the advantage of 66 million years of hindsight, can say about those bones is this. They were the remains of a Tyrannosaurus rex that had died here on this floodplain, probably 2 to 3 years earlier. The individual was slightly smaller than her, a younger animal, or a male, given that current research suggests female tyrannosaurs may have been larger than males on average, a pattern of female-biased size dimorphism documented by paleontologist Scott Persons and colleagues in a study examining femoral dimensions across multiple rex specimens. How it died, we cannot know for certain. The bones showed no evidence of traumatic injury. It may have died of disease, of infection from an old injury, of starvation following injury to a limb. The possibilities are numerous because the causes of death in large wild predators are numerous, and most of them are invisible in the fossil record. It had died here, on the same floodplain she was crossing now, and the land had absorbed it the way it absorbed everything. Slowly, completely, without ceremony. She reached the ford in the late afternoon. The river here was perhaps 60 meters wide and ankle-deep on her, meaning the water reached a depth of roughly 1 meter, spread across a gravel bed of rounded stones deposited by centuries of flood events. The current was moderate. The far bank was a low gravel bar rising into dense vegetation. The near bank offered a screen of large ferns and a fallen conifer whose root mass created a solid visual barrier from anything approaching the crossing from the east. She positioned herself behind the root mass, and she waited. Waiting for a predator of her size was not the passive activity it might appear. Every second she stood motionless behind that fallen tree, her sensory systems were running at full capacity, processing the shifting wind, reading ground vibrations, cataloging the sounds of the landscape for anything that deviated from the established baseline. The calls of small birds in the forest changed subtly when large animals moved below them, a phenomenon documented across modern forest ecosystems and used by indigenous hunters on multiple continents. She did not consciously interpret bird alarm calls, but at some level her nervous system was woven into the fabric of this ecosystem so completely that the information reached her as a kind of intuition. The wait lasted 40 minutes. Then the ground began to tell her something. Multiple footfalls. Quadrupedal rhythm on the near bank upstream, coming from the north, moving toward the ford. Several animals. The vibration pattern was familiar. Hadrosaurs. A group moving with the purposeful pace of animals heading for a known crossing point. She pressed lower behind the root mass. There were 7 of them. A mixed group. 3 large adults, 2 mid-sized individuals, 2 juveniles moving close to the adults in the way young animals do when they sense the ambient tension of a familiar but not safe place. They moved onto the gravel bar above the ford, and the lead animal, a large female, paused at the water's edge and looked across before entering. This pause, this moment of assessment before committing to the crossing, was the behavioral signature of animals that understood, on some level, that river crossings were dangerous, not because they had been told this, because the ones whose ancestors crossed without pausing had, over millions of years, tended to leave fewer descendants. The lead female entered the water. The group followed. She did not move yet. She let them enter, let them commit to the crossing, let the water rise around their legs and slow them, disrupting their movement, making rapid changes of direction costly and difficult. When the lead female was 20 meters into the crossing and the trailing juvenile, a young animal of perhaps 2 years, moving with the slightly uncoordinated energy of the not quite grown, had just entered the water at the near bank, she moved. She came around the root mass at speed, accelerating toward the water. The lead animals detected her immediately and pushed forward, surging toward the far bank with powerful thrusts of their hind limbs through the current. The adults would make it. She could read this in the first second of the charge. They were too far across, moving too fast, the far bank too close. But the juvenile at the near bank had panicked in the wrong direction. Instead of pushing across, it had turned back toward the near bank, a fear response, an instinctive retreat toward the last known safe ground. It was now at the water's edge, turning, its feet sliding on the wet gravel, its calls sharp and high with the particular frequency of young animals in distress. She hit the water at the near bank. The contact was immediate and decisive. Her jaws closed on the juvenile's pelvis, not a bite aimed at the neck or skull as Hollywood consistently depicts, but a grip on the largest available target, applied with force sufficient to prevent escape. The bone crunched audibly. The animal went down. It took less than 4 seconds. She dragged it backward out of the water onto the gravel bar and held it pinned under one massive foot. The rest of the group had reached the far bank and were moving into the forest, their alarm calls fading, their vibration signatures diminishing with distance as the evolutionary calculus of survival told them, clearly and without ambiguity, that there was nothing they could do for the one they had left behind. This is a thing that requires saying plainly, not because it is cruel. Nature has no cruelty in the moral sense, only mechanism and outcome. But because popular depictions of predation often edit this moment, cut away from it, soften it. In the actual Hell Creek ecosystem 66 million years ago, this was simply the afternoon. This was Tuesday. This was the machinery of energy transfer that kept the entire system running. The predator eating the prey, the nutrients cycling, the selective pressure maintaining the fitness of both populations by removing the slowest, the youngest, the least experienced. She fed on the kill for almost an hour. What she consumed in that hour represented the most significant caloric intake of her day, somewhere in the range of 150 kilograms of muscle tissue, organ material, and processed bone. Combined with the carrion she had consumed in the morning, she was approaching her estimated daily caloric requirement. Not there yet, but close enough that the urgency of the day's hunting had shifted from critical to moderate. She was not full. A tyrannosaur, by the nature of its digestive architecture, a relatively simple, high-throughput gut designed to process enormous volumes of material rapidly rather than extract maximum efficiency from small amounts, was probably rarely what we would call full in the mammalian sense. The system was designed to intake, process, and move on. To intake again, to keep the furnace running. But she was substantially less hungry than she had been at dawn. She stood over what remained of the kill and raised her head to the late afternoon sky. The sun was moving toward the volcanic ridgeline to the west. The light had shifted from the hard white of midday to the amber and copper tones of late afternoon, a light that was, in a strange way, not entirely unlike the late afternoon light of modern Montana, as if the sun at least had not changed so much across the millions of years between her world and ours. She breathed the cooling air. Somewhere to the north, carried faintly on the wind, came the deep, closed-mouth vocalization of another tyrannosaur. The same individual she had detected at dawn, or a different one. She could not be certain at this distance. Closer than this morning, moving south. She held still and listened. The call did not repeat. She turned west, toward the interior of the floodplain, away from the river. The afternoon was ending. The evening in the Hell Creek ecosystem was about to begin. And the evening, it turned out, would bring something that even 28 years of accumulated experience had not prepared her for. The sun touched the western ridgeline at what we might call 6 in the evening. The volcanic peaks that would one day become the early Rocky Mountains caught the last light and held it. Amber and deep orange, the colors of cooling lava and oxidized iron, spreading across a sky that was beginning to darken at its eastern edge into the deep blue of approaching night. The temperature had dropped 8 degrees in the past 2 hours. The wind had shifted, coming now from the northwest, carrying the cold mineral smell of high elevation and the faint, persistent sulfur of the distant eruptions. The floodplain in the evening light was a different landscape than the one she had moved through at dawn. Longer shadows, cooler air, the sounds of the day's shifting register, the insects adjusting their frequencies, the birds pulling back into roost positions in the tree lines, the low rhythmic calls of hadrosaurs settling near water for the night, replacing the scattered feeding sounds of the afternoon. The world was preparing for darkness in the particular way of ecosystems that had been doing exactly this through every variation of climate and catastrophe for hundreds of millions of years. She was moving northwest. The vocalization she had detected 40 minutes ago, that distant, low-frequency call from somewhere to the north, had not repeated. But the ground had continued to carry faint vibrations from that direction, irregular enough that she could not build a clear picture of what was producing them. The pattern was large, heavy, not hadrosaur, not ceratopsian. The footfall rhythm was bipedal. Another tyrannosaur. The question of how Tyrannosaurus rex responded to others of its own kind is one of the most genuinely contested areas of rex behavioral research, and one of the most consequential for understanding its daily life. The popular image is of a solitary, fiercely territorial predator that drove all competitors from its range with aggression and force. The reality, as usual, is considerably more nuanced. The fossil record offers fragmentary but suggestive evidence. Multiple rex specimens have been found in close association, not simply buried near each other by geological chance, but associated in ways that suggest they may have died together or occupied the same location simultaneously. A site in Montana known informally as the Muskrat Creek locality produced the remains of 3 tyrannosaur individuals of different ages in close proximity, leading some researchers to propose the possibility of at least occasional group behavior. A study by paleontologist Philip Curry and colleagues examining similar multi-individual tyrannosaur sites argued that some degree of social tolerance, if not active cooperation, may have been within the behavioral range of the species. Not everyone agrees. The evidence is circumstantial, the sample sizes are small, and the geological processes that concentrate fossil material can create apparent associations that have no behavioral basis. The debate remains genuinely open. What we can say with more confidence is this: tyrannosaurs knew each other as individuals. The olfactory system capable of detecting a single hadrosaur across 2 kilometers of open floodplain was certainly capable of distinguishing between individual conspecifics, other members of the same species, based on the chemical signatures carried in their scent. Modern crocodilians, whose social complexity was long underestimated, recognize individual conspecifics and maintain stable dominance relationships over years. Birds, the living dinosaurs, demonstrate individual recognition across species as cognitively varied as crows, parrots, and geese. She knew who was out there, or at least she knew enough to make a decision about it. She slowed her pace. The vibrations from the northwest had strengthened over the past 10 minutes, which meant the other animal was either moving toward her or the ground conditions between them had changed. She stopped completely and pressed one foot flat against the substrate, reducing the interference of her own footfalls and reading the incoming signal with the full sensitivity of the mechanoreceptors distributed through the thick skin of her footpads. The animal was approximately 400 meters away, moving south, toward her. She held her position and waited. The first visual contact came 3 minutes later. A movement in the tree line to the northwest where the conifers thinned at the edge of a broad open area. A shape emerging from shadow, large, moving with the forward-tilted, tail-counterbalanced posture that she recognized not as predator or prey, but as something in an entirely different category. It was a male, younger than her by perhaps 8 to 10 years. She could read this in the proportions even at distance, the slightly larger relative head size that characterized subadult tyrannosaurs, the marginally less massive build through the hindquarters. He had not yet reached his full adult dimensions. He was, by tyrannosaur standards, still in the late phase of his extraordinary adolescent growth. The phase that Gregory Erickson's research established saw tyrannosaurs gaining up to 2 kilograms of mass per day at peak rate. He had detected her scent. He stopped at the tree line and held still. What followed was, by the standards of large predator interactions documented across modern ecosystems, a completely recognizable behavioral sequence. Two animals of the same species, different sizes, encountering each other in proximity to a recent kill site. The kill she had made at the ford was perhaps 800 meters to the southeast, and its scent was almost certainly the reason he had been moving in this direction. He wanted the kill. She was between him and it. She opened her mouth slowly, not the explosive vocalization of an alarm or attack, but the low, sustained, closed-mouth resonance of an animal establishing a behavioral signal. The sound it produced was deep enough that you would have felt it in your sternum before you heard it with your ears. It carried across the open floodplain without difficulty. He answered. His vocalization was slightly higher in pitch, a function of his smaller body cavity producing a slightly smaller resonant volume, the same physics that makes a cello sound different from a double bass. Not weaker necessarily, different, carrying its own information about size and physical state that she read as clearly as a printed sign. She was larger, she was older, and she was standing between him and the food. He knew all three of these things. The interaction that followed lasted approximately 7 minutes and covered a behavioral vocabulary that we can only partially decode by reference to the large predator encounters documented in modern ecosystems. He advanced twice, slowly, testing her response. She held her position both times, her body turned 3/4 toward him, presenting her lateral profile, the broadside stance that maximizes perceived size, observed in aggressive displays from iguanas to bears to elephants. He circled left, moving toward the river flank. She pivoted to maintain her orientation to him. He did not charge. This is the critical detail, because the assumption, the Jurassic Park assumption, the Hollywood assumption, is that two tyrannosaurs encountering each other over food would immediately engage in catastrophic combat. That teeth would meet bone and the landscape would shake with the violence of titans. But large predators across all modern ecosystems are deeply, systematically reluctant to fight their own kind. The reason is not cowardice. The reason is arithmetic. A large predator injured in intraspecific combat, a torn muscle, a broken tooth, a punctured eye, faces not days of recovery, but potentially a permanent reduction in hunting capability. A predator that cannot hunt dies, and a predator that dies in combat leaves no offspring. Natural selection across millions of years has produced, in apex predators, a very strong preference for resolving conspecific disputes through display rather than contact, whenever the outcome of display is sufficiently clear. The outcome here was sufficiently clear. He was smaller. He was younger. She had not yielded ground in 7 minutes of escalating display. He circled one more time, his vocalizations shifting in frequency and rhythm in a way that, if we borrow the interpretive framework of modern archosaur communication research, corresponded to a behavioral de-escalation signal. Then he turned northeast, away from the kill site, and walked back toward the tree line. She watched him until his silhouette disappeared into the conifers. She held her position for another 4 minutes, reading the ground for his vibration signature as it diminished northward. When she was satisfied that he had moved at least a kilometer away, she lowered her head and breathed the evening air. The encounter had cost her nothing but time and metabolic energy she could afford to spend. But something about the encounter had also communicated something important about this particular evening. She was not alone in this section of the floodplain. The male was here. There may be others. The Hell Creek ecosystem 66 million years ago was not empty wilderness. It was a fully occupied, deeply contested ecological space, and the social dynamics of its apex predators were a constant background presence, shaping behavior, influencing movement decisions, determining access to food and space in ways that were as real and consequential as the physical landscape itself. She turned south, back toward the river. The light was nearly gone now. The western sky had faded from amber to deep red to a bruised purple that was deepening toward black. And the first stars, the same stars largely that we would recognize today, their constellations virtually unchanged by 66 million years of stellar movement, were appearing at the zenith. The air had dropped to 22 degrees Celsius. The moisture was rising from the cooling ground, a thin mist beginning to gather in the lower depressions of the floodplain, softening the edges of things. She moved through the early dark with a confidence that required no explanation. Her eyes, adapted to low light in the way of large predators whose activity was not strictly diurnal, could resolve shapes and movement in the near darkness of a Cretaceous evening with considerably more capability than a human's. The structure of the Tyrannosaur retina is not directly preserved in any specimen. Soft tissue almost never is. But the enlarged orbit dimensions and the forward-facing eye placement inferred from skull geometry are consistent with visual systems optimized for conditions of variable and low illumination. She could see in the dark, not as well as some nocturnal hunters, but well enough. And in the darkness, her other senses came further forward. The olfactory system that had been running all day, reading the wind, cataloging chemical information, building and updating the map of her landscape, became even more dominant as visual input reduced. The ground vibration sensitivity that gave her advance warning of large moving bodies across hundreds of meters was unaffected by darkness entirely. She was, in many practical respects, more dangerous at night than during the day. She reached the river's edge and stopped. The water was black and fast in the failing light, its surface catching the last purple of the western sky in broken, shifting fragments. Something large surfaced briefly midstream, perhaps an early crocodilian ancestor, perhaps a large fish, the movement too quick to read before it was gone. From the far bank came the low rhythmic contact calls of hadrosaurs settling for the night, the particular vocalization frequency that large herding animals use to maintain acoustic contact with group members in darkness, a sound that carried well across water. She drank. The act of a 9-ton animal lowering its enormous head to a fast-moving river to drink was not without its own mechanical complexity. The design of the Tyrannosaurus skull, that extraordinary forward-heavy structure balanced by the tail behind the hips, meant that lowering the head significantly altered her center of mass and required constant compensatory adjustment from her hind limb and tail musculature. She was not graceful about it, in the way that a giraffe is not graceful about drinking. She was stable because stability had been selected for, but the posture was effortful. She drank for perhaps 90 seconds. The volume of water she consumed in that time was significant. Large endotherms in warm environments lose water rapidly through respiration and metabolic heat, and maintaining hydration was a daily biological imperative as pressing, in its quieter way, as the imperative to feed. She raised her hand. The darkness across the river was complete now. The hadrosaur calls continued, moving slightly, the herd shifting position in the way of large animals that never fully stop moving, even when resting. An enormous moth, wingspan approaching 20 centimeters, crossed the air in front of her face, drawn towards some light or heat source she could not identify, indifferent to her presence in the way of insects everywhere. She turned away from the river. The night was fully here, and with the night came something that had been building at the edges of the day's awareness, a shift in the ambient information of the landscape that was subtle enough that she had not prioritized it during the demands of the afternoon, but persistent enough that it had registered. The western sky, which should have shown stars down to the horizon, was dark in the wrong way. Not the darkness of night, the darkness of cloud. A weather system moving in from the northwest, blocking the starlight, advancing silently across the landscape in the particular way of large storm systems that announce themselves not with immediate drama, but with the slow, steady erasure of the sky. The wind shifted, and on the new wind came something that her olfactory system had never evolved to interpret as a specific warning, because it had never needed to. An odor so ancient and so alien to biological experience that no animal in this ecosystem had any learned or instinctive response to it. The faint, high metallite smell of superheated rock. Not from the western volcanoes, from above. She raised her head to the darkening sky. She could not know what was coming. Nothing alive on this planet could know what was coming, because what was coming had never happened before in the experience of any living lineage, and would never happen again in exactly this way. And the nervous systems of every animal on this floodplain were entirely, catastrophically unprepared for it. But something in the accumulated sensory experience of 28 years told her that this evening was different. That something in the world was about to change. She stood at the edge of the river in the last hours of a day that was ending, on a planet that was ending, and she breathed the strange air. And then she moved into the darkness, because she was a predator, and predators move forward, even when everything is about to stop. Darkness in the Cretaceous was not like darkness today. There were no city lights bleeding orange into the cloud base on the horizon, no distant highways, no satellites crossing the sky in their steady mechanical arcs. When night came to the Hell Creek floodplain 66 million years ago, it came completely. A darkness so total that the landscape dissolved into pure sound and smell and vibration, the visual world simply ceasing to exist beyond the nearest shapes. She moved through it without hesitation, Her eyes resolved the darkness into gradients of gray and black, shapes rather than colors, movement rather than detail. The fallen conifer she had sheltered behind during the midday heat was a bulk of darker darkness against the sky. The river to her east was a sound and a smell and a slight lowering of the ambient temperature. The floodplain ahead of her was a vast, open absence that her other senses filled in continuously, building a map that required no light to read. The temperature had dropped to 18 degrees Celsius. Her internal metabolism compensated automatically, the biological furnace running slightly hotter to maintain her core temperature against the ambient drop. An energetic cost, modest but real, added to the day's already substantial accounting. She was moving northeast. The reason was olfactory. Sometime in the past hour, as the wind continued its northwest shift, it had begun carrying a new layer of scent information from that direction. The accumulated musk of a large hadrosaur aggregation, the smell of churned vegetation and disturbed soil, and the particular fermentation products of enormous digestive systems operating through the night. A herd, larger than the group at the ford, settled in the way of animals that had chosen a night resting location and would remain there until dawn pushed them into motion again. She was not planning an immediate attack. Large hadrosaur herds resting for the night were not easy targets. The collective sensory vigilance of dozens of animals, even sleeping ones, created a surveillance network that made approach extremely difficult. Some individuals in any large herbivore herd remain alert through the night specifically to provide this function. In the darkness, without the visual advantage of being able to see a predator approaching from downwind, hadrosaurs relied heavily on the alarm responses of their neighbors. Any individual that detected a threat would vocalize immediately, triggering the herd's collective flight response. But she was not hunting yet. She was locating, cataloging, adding to the map of tomorrow. Because this was the other function of nighttime movement that large predators with long memories and large ranges perform across modern ecosystems. Reconnaissance. A lioness moving through her territory at 3 in the morning is not necessarily hunting. She is updating her knowledge of where the prey is, where competitors are, what has changed since yesterday. This information has value tomorrow and the day after, and the week after that. She moved to within perhaps 300 meters of the herd's resting location and stopped. From here, she could read them completely. Roughly 30 individuals based on the overlapping scent signatures, the precise counting of animals by olfactory analysis alone is not something we can attribute to her with confidence, but the detection of scale, the discrimination between a handful of animals and a large group, was almost certainly within the capability of an olfactory system as powerful as hers. Adults and juveniles. The slightly sweeter, lighter scent of young animals, detectable even beneath the heavy communal musk of the adults. Juveniles meant vulnerability. She held this information and turned it the way a chess player holds a position, not acting on it yet, but knowing it was there, knowing where to come tomorrow, knowing what the morning might offer if the herd moved in the direction its current position suggested it would. Then she turned away from the herd and walked south. The night had its own rhythm, its own population of active animals moving through the same landscape she occupied. Smaller, faster, mostly nocturnal by evolutionary necessity, the darkness their primary defense against a world that was dangerous in the light. Mammals moved through the leaf litter at the forest edge, their small, warm bodies generating scent plumes she registered and dismissed. A nocturnal theropod, small, perhaps the size of a large turkey, feathered, its eyes enormous in the darkness, froze on a low branch as she passed beneath it, pressing itself flat against the bark with an instinctive stillness that had kept its lineage alive for millions of years. She passed beneath it without looking up. It was not food worth the attention, and she had learned across 28 years to calibrate her attention, to spend it only where the return justified the investment. 2 hours into the night, she found something she had not been looking for. A sound. Not vibration through the ground. Airborne sound, carried on the northwest wind, reaching her auditory system directly. Low in frequency, irregular in rhythm. The sound of large animal distress. Not the sharp, high alarm calls of immediate predator contact, but something slower and more sustained. The sound of an animal that had been struggling for some time. She stopped and oriented toward it. Southwest, perhaps 500 meters. The sound carried the acoustic signature of a large body, resonant, deep, but with an irregularity that spoke of physical compromise. Something was in difficulty. She moved toward it carefully. The source was at the edge of a wide depression in the floodplain, a low area that had held standing water during the recent rains and had not yet fully dried. In the gray darkness, her eyes resolved the shape of a large animal partially mired in the soft substrate at the depression's lowest point. It had walked into the soft ground in the darkness, perhaps following a scent trail toward water, and had sunk to mid-thigh before the substrate firmed enough to stop its descent. It was a subadult Edmontosaurus, perhaps 3 metric tons. Alone, separated from any group by either choice or circumstance, a situation of profound vulnerability for an animal whose primary defense was collective vigilance. It was alive, it was struggling, and it was going nowhere. She circled the depression slowly, reading the ground at its edges, testing the substrate with each careful footfall. The soft zone extended perhaps 15 meters from the animal, not bottomless, not the dramatic quicksand of Hollywood, but soft enough that her own mass, distributed across feet significantly smaller relative to her body weight than those of the broader-footed hadrosaur, could sink her dangerously if she moved into it carelessly. She did not move into it carelessly. She circled to the northeastern edge, where the ground firmed more quickly, a slight rise in the substrate topography, detectable through the resistance in each probing step. Here, the firm ground extended perhaps 8 meters closer to the mired animal than anywhere else around the depression's perimeter. She stopped at the edge of the firm ground. The hadrosaur had detected her. Its struggling intensified briefly, a surge of adrenaline-driven effort that accomplished nothing except to deepen its position slightly in the substrate. Its calls shifted to the high-frequency distress vocalization that carried maximum distance, announcing its situation to any conspecific within range. None answered. The night absorbed the calls and returned silence. She waited. There is something here that needs to be said carefully, because it touches on one of the most misunderstood aspects of large predator behavior, the question of patience. The assumption we often carry, shaped by the pace of human life and human attention spans, is that a predator faced with a compromised prey animal would act immediately. That urgency is the natural state of hunger. But large predators in modern ecosystems demonstrate something more sophisticated. Wolves have been documented waiting beside mired prey animals for hours before approaching. Nile crocodiles hold position near struggling animals with a patience that appears almost meditative. The investment of waiting, of allowing the prey animal to exhaust itself, to cease struggling, to become fully committed to a position it cannot escape, reduces the risk of the final approach dramatically. She was prepared to wait all night if necessary. As it turned out, she waited approximately 90 minutes. The hadrosaur's struggles became less frequent and less powerful over that time. The adrenaline that had fueled its initial response was metabolically expensive, and an animal that had been burning it for 90 minutes of sustained effort was an animal approaching exhaustion. Its calls became less frequent, its movements slowed to occasional, purposeless shifts of weight that accomplished nothing and consumed reserves it could not afford to spend. When she finally moved, she moved fast. 8 meters of firm ground covered in 2 strides. The contact was precise. Jaws closing on the base of the neck behind the skull, applying the 64,000 Newton bite force to the cervical vertebrae with the anatomical accuracy of an animal that had performed this act, or acts very like it, dozens of times across 2 decades of hunting. It was over quickly. She fed where the animal lay, in the soft ground at the edge of the depression, her own feet pressing deep into the substrate, but not sinking further once she stood still and distributed her weight. The feeding was slower than the afternoon kill. The position was awkward. The darkness made the work imprecise in ways that daylight feeding was not, and the substrate required constant attention to maintain her footing. But the food was abundant and fresh and entirely hers. She fed for over an hour. When she finally raised her head from the carcass, the night had deepened further and the wind had strengthened. The cloud system from the northwest had moved in completely now. The stars were gone, the sky a uniform deep gray, and the wind carried a new sharpness, a cold edge that was unusual for this season and this latitude. Something in the atmospheric pressure had changed. Modern animals detect barometric pressure changes through multiple physiological mechanisms: inner ear structures sensitive to pressure differentials, proprioceptive systems that respond to changes in air density, behavioral cues from the responses of other animals in the ecosystem. In the minutes before a major weather event, the behavioral changes observable across an entire ecosystem, birds falling silent, mammals seeking shelter, insects disappearing, create a biological pressure wave of information that any sufficiently attentive animal can read. The Hell Creek floodplain was going quiet. Not the natural quiet of deep night. Something else. A quality of silence that was not the absence of sound, so much as the withdrawal of it, as if the landscape itself was holding its breath. She raised her head fully and held it into the wind. The smell was stronger now. That faint, high metallic signature she had detected at the river's edge earlier in the evening. Superheated minerals, ionized air, something with no biological referent in the experience of any living creature. It was coming from the northwest, carried on the strengthening wind, and it was getting stronger with each passing minute. And then, through the soles of her feet, through the deep substrate of the Hell Creek floodplain, she felt something she had never felt before. A vibration unlike anything biological, unlike any footfall, any herd movement, any seismic tremor from the distant western volcanoes. A deep, sustained, building resonance that was coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, from the ground itself, as if the planet below her feet had begun to hum on a frequency that had no name in any living nervous system's catalog of known threats. She took 3 steps northeast. She stopped. She turned in a slow circle, reading every direction at once, every sensory system running at maximum capacity and finding nothing that her 28 years of accumulated experience had equipped her to understand. The sky to the northwest, though she could not have known to look there, could not have understood what she was seeing if she had, was no longer uniformly dark. Something was crossing it, something bright, moving faster than anything she had ever seen move across the sky, growing brighter as it moved, growing larger. The Chicxulub Impactor, 10 kilometers wide, traveling at approximately 20 kilometers per second. Having crossed the distance between the outer solar system and this exact moment on this exact floodplain over the course of 4.5 billion years of orbital mechanics, arriving now at the precise intersection of geological time and biological history that would end one world and eventually produce another, she could not know any of this. She knew only that the light was growing, that the ground was humming, that every animal on the floodplain was in motion around her in the darkness. The hadrosaur herd erupting into panicked movement 300 meters to the north, the small mammals bursting from the leaf litter and running with no direction, the nocturnal theropod launching from its branch and disappearing into the dark sky. She ran, not because she understood what she was running from, because she was a predator. And predators move forward. And forward, in the moment that the light reached a brightness that turned the night back into a blinding, shadowless day, was the only direction left. The shock wave reached the Hell Creek floodplain approximately 30 minutes after the impact. Before it arrived, the heat pulse, thermal radiation traveling at the speed of light from the impact site in what would one day be the Yucatan Peninsula, 1,500 kilometers to the south, had already ignited the upper surfaces of every conifer and cycad on the exposed floodplain. The sky was on fire before the sound arrived. And then the sound arrived. After everything, after the dawn, after the failed hunt and the carrion and the ford and the midday heat and the encounter with the young male and the night kill, after one full day of being the most dangerous animal on the most dangerous continent of the most dangerous world the Cenozoic would ever produce, after all of that, the day ended. Not just her day. The day ended for everything. The silence after the end of the world was not immediate. It took time. It took months and years and decades of slow, grinding darkness before the planet reached the particular quality of quiet that follows a mass extinction. The silence not of a single death, but of an entire category of existence simply ceasing to be. The Hell Creek floodplain, which had been one of the most biologically rich environments on Earth on the morning she woke up, became something else entirely. Something that had no name yet, because nothing alive was left to name it. The Chicxulub impactor struck the shallow carbonate platform of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula with a force equivalent to roughly 10 billion Hiroshima bombs, a figure so large it ceases to function as a meaningful comparison and becomes simply a measure of the incomprehensible. The impact excavated a crater approximately 180 kilometers in diameter. It vaporized billions of tons of sulfur-bearing rock instantly, injecting sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere in quantities sufficient to trigger a global temperature drop of somewhere between 8 and 17 degrees Celsius within months. The initial thermal pulse, the heat flash that preceded the shock wave, ignited forests across the Western Hemisphere. Ejecta lofted into the upper atmosphere, rained back down across the entire planet as superheated particles, converting the upper atmosphere briefly into a thermal radiator that cooked exposed surfaces across thousands of kilometers. The darkness that followed lasted years, not days, not weeks. Years of reduced sunlight, as stratospheric sulfate aerosols and soot from global wildfires blocked enough solar radiation to collapse photosynthesis across most of the planet. The food web, built on millions of years of accumulated biological complexity, unwound from the bottom up. The plants died first, or rather, stopped producing at the scale the ecosystem required. The herbivores that depended on them followed. The predators that depended on the herbivores followed after that. Tyrannosaurus rex, at the apex of a food web that had just had its foundation removed, had nowhere left to stand. The last tyrannosaur died sometime in the first years after the impact. We cannot be more precise than that. The fossil record at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, the thin layer of iridium-rich clay that marks the impact in geological sections worldwide, first identified by Luis and Walter Alvarez in 1980 at a site in Gubbio, Italy, shows non-avian dinosaur fossils right up to the boundary layer and then simply stops. There is no gradual decline visible in the Hell Creek record, no slow fade. One layer, dinosaurs. Next layer, none. 66 million years of theropod evolution terminated in what the geological timescale rounds to an instant. But here is the thing that changes everything about how we tell this story. They did not all die. One lineage of small feathered theropods, the avian dinosaurs, the birds, survived. How, exactly, remains one of the genuinely fascinating open questions in extinction biology. The current best hypothesis, supported by research published in Current Biology by Daniel Field and colleagues at Cambridge University, centers on the particular vulnerability of forests in the immediate post-impact period. Most bird lineages of the Cretaceous were forest-dependent. They nested in trees, fed on forest resources, structured their entire biology around a habitat that had just been catastrophically disrupted globally. These lineages went extinct along with the forests, but the ancestors of modern birds, ground-dwelling, seed-eating, capable of surviving on resources that persisted through the darkness, made it through. Seeds buried in soil can remain viable for years without sunlight. An animal that could survive on them could outlast the worst of the collapse. From those survivors over the 66 million years between the impact and this moment, every bird alive today descended. Every sparrow, every eagle, every penguin standing on Antarctic ice, every albatross crossing the Pacific on a 10-meter wingspan, every chicken in every farm on every continent. All of them are dinosaurs. She is not gone. She was transformed, and the transformation is visible in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to the paleontologists of a century ago. The wishbone, the furcula, that gives a modern bird its characteristic chest structure, was present in tyrannosaurs, visible in well-preserved Rex specimens, including the famous specimen known as Sue, now housed at the Field Museum in Chicago. Sue represents one of the most complete Tyrannosaurus Rex specimens ever recovered, approximately 90% complete, excavated from the Hell Creek Formation of South Dakota by fossil hunter Sue Hendrickson in 1990, and subsequently the subject of one of the most significant and contentious legal disputes in the history of American paleontology, before being purchased at auction for $8.3 million. Sue's bones tell stories that no amount of imaginative reconstruction could have predicted. The wishbone. Air sacs, hollow spaces in the vertebrae and elsewhere in the skeleton, indicative of a respiratory system that pumped air through the lungs in one direction rather than in and out as in mammals, exactly as in modern birds, providing extraordinary oxygen extraction efficiency. Evidence of brooding behavior in closely related theropods, oviraptorosaurs found atop egg clutches in positions identical to those of brooding modern birds, their arms spread to cover the eggs. Quill knobs, attachment points for large feathers, documented on the forearms of tyrannosaur relatives like Eutyrannus huali, the feathered tyrannosauroid described from China by Xu Xing and colleagues in 2012, a species that reached 9 meters in length and was covered in filamentous proto-feathers. Whether adult Tyrannosaurus rex carried feathers remains one of the most vigorously debated questions in current paleontology. Skin impressions from rex specimens, Preserved patches of integument from multiple individuals, including material from the neck, pelvis, and tail, show a pebbly scaled texture with no evidence of feather attachment. This has led some researchers to conclude that large odontorex were largely or entirely scaled. But the debate is not closed. The skin impressions we have are fragmentary and may not represent the full range of integument across the animal's body. Juveniles may have been feathered and lost their covering as adults, a pattern seen in some modern large birds. The question of what she looked like, in the most fundamental visual sense, remains genuinely, productively open. This is science working as it should. The history of our understanding of Tyrannosaurus rex is itself a story worth telling. A story of assumptions overturned, certainties dissolved, and a picture built and rebuilt across more than a century of discovery. When Henry Fairfield Osborn named the species Tyrannosaurus rex in 1905, based on material excavated by Barnum Brown from the Hell Creek Formation of Montana, he conceived of it as an upright, tail-dragging, cold-blooded giant. The popular image for much of the 20th century was exactly this: a creature holding its body nearly vertical, its heavy tail dragging on the ground behind it, lurching rather than striding. Every part of that image was wrong. The tail did not drag. Trackway evidence from multiple theropod sites shows no tail drag marks accompanying the footprints, confirming that the tail was held horizontal and clear of the ground. The posture was not upright, but strongly horizontal. The body held roughly parallel to the ground, balanced at the hips, the head forward and low. The metabolism was not reptilian, but closer to avian. The sensory systems were sophisticated beyond anything Osborn's generation imagined. The behavior was complex, the cognition potentially remarkable, the ecological role profound and system-wide. And the understanding continues to shift. In 2019, a study by Paul Sereno and colleagues at the University of Chicago proposed, based on analysis of brain endocasts from multiple Tyrannosaur specimens, that the olfactory bulbs of Rex were proportionally larger than those of any other known theropod, larger even than would be predicted by simple body size scaling. The implication: that olfactory capability was not merely one tool among many in the Rex sensory repertoire, but a defining primary sense that shaped everything about how the animal experienced and navigated its world. The world of Tyrannosaurus rex was, first and most deeply, a world of smell. A 2022 study by Thomas Carr at Carthage College, examining the distribution of nerve foramina, small holes through which nerves passed to reach the skin of the face, in tyrannosaur skulls, found evidence of an extraordinarily dense network of facial sensory nerves, comparable in distribution to those of crocodilians, which use similar facial sensitivity for detecting water pressure changes and temperature differentials during aquatic predation. The possibility raised by this finding, that tyrannosaurs had highly sensitive facial skin capable of fine tactile discrimination, adds yet another dimension to an animal we thought we understood. We did not understand it. We are still learning. There are currently more than 50 relatively complete Tyrannosaurus rex specimens in museum collections worldwide, with new material being recovered and described regularly. Each new specimen has added something to the picture: a healed injury that tells us about the social behavior, a bone pathology that tells us about the diseases these animals carried, a growth ring that tells us about the individual's life history. A specimen nicknamed Scotty, recovered from the Frenchman Formation of Saskatchewan, Canada, and described by Scott Persons and colleagues in 2019, is currently the largest known individual by estimated mass, approximately 8.8 metric tons, based on limb bone circumference scaling. Scotty also shows extensive evidence of injuries sustained and survived across a long life. broken ribs, an infected jaw, damage to the tail vertebrae consistent with a bite from another tyrannosaur. Scotty was old and scarred and formidably large. Scotty was, in the language of the fossil record, a survivor. Every specimen is a survivor, in the sense that matters for science. It survived long enough to become stone, to be buried and preserved, to be discovered, to be studied, to add its particular and irreplaceable data point to our slowly accumulating picture of a world that ended 66 million years ago and left its bones in the ground for us to find. The Hell Creek Formation continues to yield material. The Judith River Formation, the Lance Formation, the Scholard Formation in Canada. Across the full geographic range of Laramidia, in the Badlands and the river cuts and the eroding hillsides of the American and Canadian West, the bones of Tyrannosaurus rex are still coming out of the ground. Some of them have been waiting there for 66 million years. Through the rise of the mammals and the evolution of the primates and the emergence of the hominins and the entire compressed, frantic, improbable story of human civilization, waiting in the stone for someone to come and ask the right questions. We are still asking the right questions. What was its growth rate in the first year of life? We have very few juvenile rex specimens. The fossil record is heavily biased toward large adults whose bones were robust enough to survive the fossilization process. The early life history of Tyrannosaurus rex remains one of the significant gaps in our knowledge. Did it vocalize in the ways we have described, or in ways we have not yet imagined? The soft tissue structures of the vocal apparatus are not preserved. We infer from relatives. We model from physics. We do not know. Did it have a social structure more complex than solitary ranging with occasional tolerance of conspecifics? The multi-individual sites suggest something. The something is not yet defined. Did it sleep in the way we described, lying down, flanks rising and falling in the pre-dawn dark? Large modern birds and crocodilians both sleep lying down in various postures. The musculoskeletal architecture of tyrannosaurs suggests lying down was possible and probably necessary for extended rest. But we have no direct evidence. We have inference, and inference's honest companion, uncertainty. How did it raise its young? Did it? Were the eggs? No rex egg has been definitively identified, though theropod eggs from related lineages are known. Attended, brooded, left to develop independently? Did the hatchlings receive parental care? For how long? These questions will be answered partially by the next generation of discoveries, by the next bone eroding out of a Hell Creek hillside in North Dakota, by the next CT scan of a specimen that has been sitting in a museum drawer for 40 years, waiting for the technology to ask it new questions, by the next researcher who stands in a badland in August with a rock hammer and a brush, and the particular irreplaceable combination of knowledge and curiosity and stubbornness that paleontology demands of the people who practice it. The day we followed ended 66 million years ago. But the story did not. She left no descendants in the direct sense. The lineage of large-bodied tyrannosaurs ended at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary with the same completeness as everything else that could not survive the darkness. But she left something more durable than descendants. She left bones. She left footprints pressed into the mud of a floodplain and compressed into stone over millions of years of geological time. She left chemical signatures in the rock, isotope ratios and protein fragments and trace element distributions that researchers are only now developing the tools to read. She left in the evolutionary heritage of every bird that has ever sung or soared or swum or stalked its prey through tall grass, the deep structural memory of what a theropod body can become when it has 150 million years and sufficient selective pressure to work with. She left in us in the particular human obsession with these animals that fills museums and drives children to study Latin binomials before they can reliably tie their shoes, something harder to name, but no less real. A recognition, perhaps, a resonance across the gulf of deep time, the sense that something mattered here, that the story of life on this planet is not a prelude to the story of us, but a vast, self-sufficient, endlessly complex narrative in which we are a very recent and very brief chapter. 66 million years ago, on a floodplain that will one day become Montana, a Tyrannosaurus rex woke before dawn and began her day. She hunted, she fed, she rested, she competed. She survived the hours that most of us could not have survived a single minute of. And then, the sky fell. And the world she had mastered, the world that had taken 500 million years of evolution to build to the precise specification required to produce her, ended. And from the ashes and the darkness, and the slow, grinding recovery of life across the following millions of years, something else grew. Eventually, improbably, something grew that could look back across 66 million years of stone and silence and ask, what was it like? We are still finding out, and the ground still holds its secrets. Go outside tonight. Find a place dark enough to see the stars. Look up at the same sky she stood beneath. The same stars, mostly, their positions barely shifted by 66 million years of stellar drift. Think about the depth of the time between that moment and this one. Think about everything that lived and died and was transformed in that interval. Then think about the fact that we know any of this at all. That is the real miracle of paleontology, not the bones, not the formations, not the equations and the isotopes and the CT scans. The miracle is that we can ask the question, and that the Earth, if you know how to listen, is still answering. The real miracle of paleontology, not the bones, not the formations, not the equations and the isotopes and the CT scans. The miracle is that we can ask the question, and that the Earth, if you know how to listen, is still answering.